because it is absolutely brilliant. I mean, you are completely missing the forest for the trees here.
Wait.
Jacques Fighter's Faces of Children, Visage d'Enfant from 1925, right? It is a properly genius piece of early cinema.
I am not dismissing it.
It practically invented modern child psychology on film.
Yeah.
And you are just dismissing it out of hand.
I am not dismissing it out of hand. I'm just saying you need to take a breath and look at the actual historical facts here.
I am looking at the facts.
It's a bit overhyped, isn't it? I mean, the film was a total commercial failure when it came out. And quite frankly, the pacing and the narrative structure are, well, they're seriously dodgy in places. You're giving it way too much credit for.
Dodgy. You have got to be kidding me.
It is.
Look, if you are listening to this, you are going to have to settle a massive row for us right now. We are currently tearing our hair out over the details in this massive historical text.
It's a very thick book.
Right.
Cinema, the magic vehicle, a comprehensive guide. Journey 1, 1913 to 1950.
Undeniable visionary leap this film represents.
Because it wasn't a visionary leap.
It was.
It was a chaotic, bloody shambles that occasionally stumbled into a nice frame. You're reading this text like it's gospel.
I'm reading what's there.
But if you actually unpack what happened behind the scenes and what actually made it onto the screen, it is a completely different story.
I am unpacking it.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing on the screen is a psychological pressure cooker. One that was like decades ahead of its time.
Oh, come off it.
No, seriously. Put yourself in the shoes of a 1920s moviegoer for a second, right? You're used to broad comedies.
Yeah.
Sweeping historical epics.
Theatrical acting.
Exactly. Theatrical acting with lots of flailing arms and big expressions. And then you sit down in the dark and watch Faces of Children. We've got this sensitive 9-year-old boy, Jane Amsler, played by little Jean Forrest.
Good actor. I'll give you that.
Incredible actor. His mother dies. It's completely tragic, deeply quiet, internalized grief.
Right.
And then his father, Pierre, who's the mayor of the local village, Saint-Luc, by the way.
Which is important.
Right. So there's this whole heavy facade of civic respectability pressing down on the family. So the father goes off and secretly remarries.
Secretly being the operative word there.
And who does he remarry? A young widow named Jeanne Dutoit, the exact same first name as the dead mother.
Which...
Wait, let me finish. That is a properly genius psychological trigger.
Are you joking?
Think about what that means to a child. Think about the sheer terror of erasure for a grieving 9-year-old.
It's a cheap trick.
It's like a corrupted hard drive and computer, isn't it? The kid doesn't have the emotional operating system to process the trauma of his mother dying.
Okay, the computer analogy is a bit much.
No, listen. Now, the new software being installed has the exact same file name as the old one. It completely overrides his memory. The hardware just violently crashes.
Right. What?
It is a brilliant way to visually and conceptually show mental collapse. In a silent film, no less, where you literally cannot use dialogue to explain how the kid is feeling.
Properly genius. Are you actually hearing yourself? It is cheap.
It's not cheap.
It is textbook, sentimental soap opera writing. Oh, let's give the new stepmother the exact same name to artificially ramp up the angst.
It's symbolic.
It's a convoluted plot device. It's designed to manipulate the audience, not to present some high-minded psychological thesis. And let's talk about Pierre for a second.
The father.
Yes, this so-called respectable mayor. He goes off to secretly marry this woman and just dumps his kid in the neighboring Vissoye Valley.
With his godfather.
With his godfather, Father Tellier. For the duration of the wedding, he completely hides it from him.
He's trying to protect the boy from the shock.
Yeah. That's rubbish, mate. He doesn't even tell the boy what he's doing. He essentially abandons his grieving son to go on a honeymoon.
It was a different time.
That's not high art. That's just fundamentally bad parenting used as a lazy way to generate plot conflict. I mean, if the father just sat the kid down and had a 5-minute conversation, you wouldn't have a movie.
Hold on a second. You are judging 1920s rural Swiss parenting by, modern therapy standards, which is entirely missing the point.
I'm judging narrative structure.
You're expecting a rigidly traditional stoic mountain man in 1925 to sit down and practice active listening with a 9-year-old.
I expect him to not abandon his kid.
The film isn't saying Pierre is father of the year. It's using that exact emotional abandonment to fuel Jean's psychological descent.
I understand that, but...
No, hear me out. When Jean comes back from the Vissoye Valley and finds this strange woman with his mother's name...
Yes, the cheap plot device.
...installed in his house, acting as the lady of the manor, he actually tries to show goodwill at first. He really does.
It was about 5 minutes.
But he has no outlet. The resentment just festers. It bubbles under the surface, and it all culminates in that sleigh ride scene,
Oh, the avalanche.
which is one of the most chilling things I have ever seen in a silent film.
Which is incredibly contrived, if we're being honest. It's an action set piece pretending to be a character study.
How can you call it rather dull when a 9-year-old is casually orchestrating an avalanche death for his new little stepsister? That's mental.
It's dramatic, sure.
I want you, the listener, to really picture this scene. Think about the psychology of a child doing this. He takes his new stepsister, Arlette,
Who is totally innocent in all this.
completely innocent, but he resents her completely because she represents the physical invasion of his home. And during this sleigh ride in the snow, he surreptitiously,
Sneakily.
quietly, maliciously, throws her doll out of the sled into the deep snow.
Right.
And then later, he encourages her to go look for it in the dark, in the freezing alpine mountains,
Leading to an avalanche.
leading to her nearly dying in an actual avalanche. It's that corrupted hard drive exploding in the coldest, most calculating way possible.
Okay, I will grant you that it is dark for 1925. I'll give you that.
Thank you.
The idea of a child passively attempting murder via avalanche is striking, but my issue is how we get there mechanically.
What do you mean mechanically?
It's melodrama. It relies on the absolute extremes of human behavior and nature to provoke a reaction from the audience. The book, Cinema, the Magic Vehicle, tries to frame this as some sort of deep, sensitive, psychological exploration of childhood anxiety.
Because it is.
But throwing a doll into a snowbank to trigger an avalanche so the little girl gets buried alive, that is basically a James Bond villain plot executed by a toddler.
Oh, that's so cynical.
It lacks nuance. It is entirely spectacle.
It doesn't lack nuance. It's a physical manifestation of an internal state. Again, we were talking about silent cinema here.
But I know what we're talking about.
You don't have the luxury of a voiceover explaining the boy's inner turmoil. The kid doesn't have the vocabulary to say, "Father, I feel my identity and my mother's memory are being threatened by this interloper."
Obviously not.
So he acts out in the only way the brutal landscape allows. The environment itself becomes the weapon.
It's still a contrived weapon.
The snow, the cold, the isolation, they are external mirrors of what is happening inside Gene's head, which, by the way, directly ties into how chaotic and raw the actual production of this film was.
Oh, here we go.
Because if you want to understand why this film feels so dangerously real, you have to look at how it was made. The behind-the-scenes reality was just as dark and messy as Gene's psyche.
Now here is where we get to the real historical meat of it.
Right.
Because if you want to talk about chaos, the production of Faces of Children was an absolute bloody shambles.
I prefer to call it trial by fire.
You would. But let's look at the actual timeline the book lays out for us, because it is wild.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
They start filming in the late spring and summer of 1923.
Right.
They are shooting in the Valois Canton in Switzerland. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, the book specifically notes this is the highest inhabited region in Europe.
Which is absolutely stunning on camera.
Stunning, yes, but think about the logistics in 1923. You are dragging heavy, hand-cranked wooden cameras, highly flammable nitrate film stock, and a full crew up into the freezing high-altitude Alps.
It's a massive undertaking.
There is no modern infrastructure. You are fighting the weather, the light, the altitude sickness, so they are already dealing with a logistical nightmare just by being there.
Right. But that adds to the gritty reality of it.
Wait, hear me out. What does our quote-unquote visionary director, Jacques Feyder, do in the middle of this incredibly difficult, expensive location shoot?
He protects his film.
He gets into a massive row with his producers, Dmitry Dzubulov and Arthur Adrian Porcher.
A disagreement over the artistic direction. Feyder was fiercely protective of his vision.
A disagreement over money and control. Let's be real about how the film industry worked back then. Producers held the purse strings, and Feyder was hemorrhaging money on top of a mountain.
He wanted it to be perfect.
So Feyder, instead of being a professional and finding a compromise, throws a tantrum. He completely abandons the Parisian studio scenes that were scheduled next.
He refused to compromise his art.
He just walks away from his own film. He leaves the country entirely and goes to work in Austria and Hungary for a year. A full year.
He was a man of principles.
He was a man who breached his contract. And it gets worse. He leaves his wife,
Françoise Rosé.
yes, who was acting as his assistant director and whom the book rather romantically calls his muse. He leaves her to finish the autumn shooting without him.
She did an incredible job, to be fair.
Imagine that, though. He abandons his crew, He abandons his child actors, and he abandons his wife in the freezing Alps to clean up his mess and shoot the transitional autumn scenes while he swans off to Vienna.
It wasn't swanning off.
The man was an arrogant git, and any success this film has is a total disjointed fluke born of his negligence.
Hold on a second. You're punishing the art for the sins of the artist.
I'm looking at the reality of the production.
Yes, he might have been difficult to work with, but if the final cut works, which it does, why does it matter if the timeline was a complete mess?
Because it proves it wasn't a master plan.
Yes, Feder stormed off to Hungary. Yes, the film sat completely unedited, in cans, for another full year after Rosé somehow managed to finish that brutal autumn shoot. But look at what that delay actually forced them to do.
It forced them into a state of total creative paralysis and near bankruptcy is what it did.
No, it forced geographical and professional isolation. Think about it logically. If Feder hadn't had that massive bust-up with Zubeloff and Porcher, if he had just nodded along like a good little employee and gone back to the Parisian studios to film the interior scenes like they originally planned, what would have happened?
They would have finished the film on time and on budget.
The film would have looked like every other polished, artificial, overly lit studio picture of the 1920s. Have you seen typical studio interiors from 1925?
Yes, some of them are quite nice.
They look like stage plays. They are flat. By abandoning the studio portion of the shoot entirely, the film was forced to rely on that raw, location-based reality.
Only because he ran away.
The Valois Canton wasn't just a painted backdrop anymore. It became the whole world of the film.
That is a massive leap in logic.
It's exactly what the text implies.
You're retroactively justifying bad behavior. You're saying his unprofessional tantrum is the secret sauce to the film's realism.
I'm saying it's the crucible that forged the film. If Feder hadn't stormed off, would the film have been ruined by studio interference in Paris?
We don't know that.
Absolutely it would have. Zubeloff and Porcher would have demanded cleaner lighting, happier expressions, more traditional static framing to guarantee a return on their investment.
They just wanted a film they could sell.
By leaving it unfinished and letting it sit in the can for a year, it accidentally preserved that stark, brutal Alpine reality. Françoise Rosé capturing those autumn scenes without the producers breathing down Feder's neck. That birthed an accidental masterpiece.
Accidental being the key word.
You have to give her immense credit, by the way. An assistant director stepping up to manage a location shoot in the Alps in 1923. That is Herculean.
It is Herculean for Rosé, yes. I have no issue with her. But accidental masterpiece is an oxymoron when applied to Feder.
How so?
You cannot claim Jacques Feder is a genius auteur with a masterful grasp of child psychology in one breath, and then in the exact next breath say his film is brilliant, precisely because he abandoned it and let accidents and his wife's emergency autumn shoot shape the final product.
He set the tone before he left.
You have to pick one. The reality is, a director abandoning a project mid-shoot is the hallmark of a shambles, not a strategy. And it completely undercuts your entire argument about his deliberate visionary visual style.
I completely disagree. Because the visual style was already established by Feder before he left for Austria, and it is a massive, deliberate departure from his earlier work.
A departure forced by circumstance.
No, listen to the text. Look at what Cinema the Magic Vehicle says about his previous film, Old Bill of Paris.
A very different movie.
Exactly. In that film, Feder used all these incredibly complex formal devices.
Yeah.
Extreme close-ups, subjective narrative camera work. He was trying to literally get inside the characters' heads with a camera lens.
Right.
It's very flashy, very expressionistic. But in Faces of Children, he actively strips all of that away. He relies on this incredibly simple, austere, beautifully stark photography by his cinematographers, Lance Henry Burrell and Paul Pargel.
I was completely gobsmacked by this shift when I read about it. It's spot on.
Or, hear me out,
But
he stripped all those fancy camera tricks away because he was out of money and out of time.
that's rubbish, mate. You're reducing a profound aesthetic choice to a line item on a budget spreadsheet.
And you are romanticizing a severe lack of resources. It's called minimalism.
Let's explain this for the listener. What does a subjective close-up actually require in 1923?
a camera and an actor.
No, it requires massive, heavy arc lamps to expose the slow film stock properly. It requires electricity. It requires a controlled environment where the wind isn't blowing the camera over.
They were outdoors.
Exactly. Look at the facts of this production. It is a financial disaster. He's fighting tooth and nail with the producers over every franc.
Right.
He's stuck in the highest inhabited region in Europe where dragging a generator up a mountain is next to impossible. Do you honestly think he sat down in his director's chair and thought, yes, the purest way to express this child's grief is to eschew the subjective close-up and embrace austere, natural, light-wide shots?
Yes, I do think that.
No. He couldn't afford the complex lighting setups required for those intimate close-ups in the freezing mountains.
Believe.
Let me finish. He used the local alpine population as extras in their authentic folk costumes.
Which was brilliant.
You read the book and see that as authentic, visionary realism. I look at the production history and see it as saving a quid because they literally couldn't afford to transport, house, and pay professional union extras from Paris.
Doesn't matter why he did it.
It was a pragmatic necessity disguised later by critics as an artistic choice.
But the result is what matters. Why does the motivation invalidate the beauty of the image?
Because you're calling him a genius for a budget cut.
Using the locals in their actual worn-in folk costumes gives the film a textual reality that a pristine Paris backlot could never, ever replicate. You can see the weather in their faces.
Okay, yes, they look authentic.
And those wide shots, letting the sheer, brutal scale of the snowbound mountain valleys completely dwarf this tiny, grieving child. Let me explain the mechanism of why that works so brilliantly.
Go on, then.
When you put a small human figure against a massive, unmoving, blindingly white mountain in a silent film, it unconsciously signals total, crushing isolation to the human brain.
Standard visual metaphor.
But he does it so well. You don't need a close-up of a tear rolling down his cheek. The mountain is the emotion. It acts as a visual equivalent of the child's inner life.
It's just a mountain, mate.
It's a literal metaphor for childhood innocence being frozen and buried under the weight of adult decisions. It's a profound cinematic leap forward, scaling back the camera tricks to let the brutal environment do the emotional heavy lifting.
It's a nice theory.
It's what the book says.
It sounds great in a film studies classroom, but it completely falls apart when you look at the climax of the film.
The climax is amazing.
If Fader is this absolute master of austere, unsentimental, environmental realism, how do you explain the ending? Because the ending is pure, unadulterated soap opera.
The ending is the necessary release of the pressure cooker.
The ending is absurd. Let's walk the listener through it.
Fine.
Jean, our 9-year-old protagonist, is tormented by the guilt of almost killing his little stepsister Arlette in the avalanche.
Right.
So what does he do? This 9-year-old boy writes a formal valedictory suicide note,
It's heartbreaking.
marches out to a roaring, freezing mountain river, and throws himself in to end his own life. A 9-year-old boy.
Exactly. It's the ultimate breaking point.
It's ridiculous.
The stark, freezing visual of that raging river is the physical manifestation of his complete psychological break. His hard drive has crashed so violently that the machine is literally destroying itself.
Yes, fine, the river is cold. But then what happens?
It gets saved.
He is saved by the stepmother, Jean, the very woman he has been torturing, resenting, and rejecting for the entire runtime of the film.
Which is the whole point.
She magically swoops in, risks her own life, pulls him from the freezing water, and suddenly, all is forgiven. The psychological trauma just washes away downstream.
He's a catharsis.
He changes his entire attitude, becomes perfectly reconciled to her and the stepsister he just tried to bury in an avalanche, and we roll credits.
You're oversimplifying it.
It is incredibly sentimental. It completely undercuts the austere, brutal realism you were just praising 5 minutes ago. It's a neat, tidy, melodramatic bow tied onto a chaotic, messy production to guarantee a happy ending.
It is not a tidy bow. It's survival. You're looking at it far too cynically.
I'm looking at it realistically.
Think about the psychology of survival trauma. When a child experiences that level of sustained grief, and then physically brushes up against death in a freezing alpine river, no less, where the shock to the nervous system is absolute, that trauma is going to brutally reset their psychological baseline.
Reset their baseline. He tried to kill himself.
And he was saved. The fact that the stepmother, the quote-unquote interloper, physically risks her own life to pull him out of the water is the undeniable proof he needed that she isn't there to replace his dead mother, but to protect him.
It's still too neat.
It shatters his delusion. It's not cheap sentimentality, it's catharsis. And it makes perfect logical sense when you actually examine the psychology of the man who directed it.
Oh, here we go. We're doing amateur psychoanalysis of a dead Belgian director now.
No, listen.
Yeah.
You have to connect the art to the artist here to understand why this film operates the way it does.
Do we really?
Jacques Feyder wasn't just some hired gun studio director. He was injecting his own deep-seated childhood trauma directly into this film.
Everyone had trauma in the 20s.
The text is very clear about his background. He was Belgian-born, started as an actor in France in the early 1920s. But the key detail, the absolute key to understanding Faces of Children, is his fierce, lifelong resentment of the bourgeoisie and bourgeois institutions.
Yes, a resentment originating from the quote-unquote treatment he had received from his family, according to the text.
Exactly.
Which is a very polite way of saying he had daddy issues.
You are so dismissive. He harbored this massive anti-establishment grudge because of his own family trauma.
Right, and he projected it onto a 9-year-old.
To Feyder, the bourgeoisie wasn't just an economic class. It represented rigid, hypocritical family structures that crushed individuality and emotional honesty. You see it play out throughout his entire career.
If you look hard enough.
Later, in his 1928 film Les Nouveaux Messieurs, he skewered the political establishment so badly that the censors absolutely hated him and banned the film. Feyder was a rebel.
A rebel who couldn't balance a budget.
And if you understand auteur theory, the idea that a director is the singular author of a film, injecting their own personal themes into every frame, then Faces of Children makes perfect sense.
That's a big if.
He was taking his own hatred of being controlled by respectable, emotionless bourgeois parents and mapping it onto little Jean Forest, the father, Pierre, the mayor of Saint-Luc.
Yeah, the guy who abandons his kid.
He isn't just a bad dad who drops his kid at the Godfather's house. He's the literal embodiment of the bourgeois hypocrisy that Feyder utterly despised.
You can't be serious?
I am absolutely serious. It's all there in the text.
You are projecting a level of grand auteur theory onto this guy that simply isn't supported by his actual career trajectory. You're painting him as this tragic, misunderstood, cinematic rebel who was just too brilliant for his time.
He was.
Let's look at the actual text again. The book explicitly states that despite his massive mobility across the global film industry, working in France, Austria, Hungary, Germany, Hollywood, the UK, Switzerland, his ambitions nowhere translated into commercial success.
So?
The man was a commercial failure. If he was such a brilliant communicator of the human condition, why wasn't anyone buying tickets?
Since when does commercial success equal artistic merit? Are you seriously arguing that?
I'm not saying it's the only metric.
That is the most reductive, cynical way to look at film history. By that logic, a modern blockbuster superhero movie is artistically superior to a brilliant indie drama just because it sold more popcorn.
It doesn't equal artistic merit, obviously, but it does indicate whether an artist is actually communicating effectively with their intended audience. Cinema is a mass medium, mate. It costs money to make.
That doesn't mean you have to pander to the lowest common denominator.
Feyder wasn't a misunderstood auteur. He was a bitter, self-sabotaging director who projected his own unresolved mommy and daddy issues onto the screen, alienating his audience and infuriating the censors alike.
That is so unfair.
He made a miserable, dark film about a miserable, homicidal child because he was deeply miserable himself, and nobody in 1925 wanted to pay their hard-earned money to sit in a theater and see it.
Because it was too serious for its time.
Yeah.
The book explicitly says exactly that.
It says he had interests in the dark realities of childhood.
Yes. Faces of Children stemmed from his personal, deep-seated interests in the dark realities of childhood, which he also explored in his script for The Redhead. It turned out to be far too heavy for a 1925 audience that just wanted light post-World War I escapism.
So he misread the room.
Feyder was like a punk rocker born decades too early. Imagine a band playing loud, distorted grunge music to an audience that showed up expecting a polite Viennese waltz.
They'd walk out.
They're going to cover their ears and walk out. But that doesn't mean the grunge music is bad. He's throwing raw, unvarnished emotional trauma at an audience not equipped for it.
An audience that just survived a world war.
Exactly. They didn't want trauma on screen. You're holding his lack of box office receipts against him as if being unpopular in 1925 makes the art less valid today.
I'm not saying the art is invalid. I'm saying the artist was undisciplined. A true master, a real genius, figures out how to convey complex, dark themes within a narrative structure that actually engages the audience.
He did engage them.
Rather than repelling them with child-on-child avalanche murder and then blaming them for not getting it. His anti-establishment posturing and his feuds with producers might make for a fun biography, but in reality it resulted in a disjointed, chaotic film shoot and a fractured nomadic career. He couldn't play the game.
But look at the legacy. You absolutely cannot ignore the legacy of what he achieved, even if it was a financial flop.
The legacy is overstated.
Cinema, the magic vehicle, literally states, in black and white, that Faces of Children was dramatically ahead of its time.
According to the authors.
They argue it was approaching the realist cinema of a quarter of a century later. They draw a direct, undeniable line from this obscure 1925 silent film to René Clamont's famous film, The Secret Game, in the 1950s. That is massive.
It is a massive stretch, is what it is.
It is not a stretch. Let's explain what 1950s realism actually means for the listener.
Keep it brief.
After World War II, filmmakers in Europe, especially in Italy and France, started the neorealism movement. They stopped shooting in fake studios. They took the cameras out into the bombed-out streets.
Because the studios are bombed out.
They used natural lighting. They focused on the grim, raw struggles of working-class people, and they often used non-professional actors, especially children, to capture unvarnished truth. Does that sound familiar?
Vaguely.
Without the raw, unpolished, snowy grit of Faces of Children. Without Fader stripping away the artificiality of the Parisian studios.
By running away.
Without him using real locations and real alpine locals to tell a dark, anxious story about a child's inner life 25 years earlier, the later European realist movements wouldn't have had a foundational text. He paved the way.
I will concede exactly 1 point to you and to this massive book. Just one.
Let's hear it then.
The performance of little Jean Forrest. The book is right about that. We have to give credit where it's due.
Oh, brilliant.
Despite all of Fader's sentimentality, despite the shambolic production schedule, despite the freezing cold, Jean Forrest's acting is genuinely remarkable and deeply convincing for 1924.
Right, because he's not pantomiming.
Exactly. In silent films, actors often relied on theatrical pantomime. Wide eyes, clutching the chest, huge gestures.
Because they had no dialogue.
To convey emotion, yes, because
Yeah.
they had no dialogue. Forrest doesn't do that. He internalizes the grief. He has a quiet, brooding presence that somehow cuts right through the melodrama of the avalanche and the river suicide.
It's mesmerizing.
It is a fantastic performance, but I aggressively reject the broader claim that this one good performance in a chaotic, commercially dead film somehow birthed the entire 1950s realism movement.
It was a stepping stone.
Saying Faces of Children paved the way for The Secret Game is just a modern critic looking backward through history and drawing imaginary lines between disconnected data points to justify their own obscure academic tastes.
They aren't obscure tastes. It's the literal evolution of visual language. You were just stubbornly refusing to see how the stark austerity of those Valois Canton shoots.
The austerity was a budget cut. It was born of necessity, not vision.
The austerity forced a focus on human reality over technical trickery. Let me just read you this final quote from my notes, because the book literally says...
Oh, please, not another quote about his austere genius.
It says, the film's absolute strength is its dramatic use of the locality, providing a visual equivalent of a child's inner life. You cannot fake that on a backlot.
You can if your stepmother magically fishes you out of a raging river at the last possible second and cures your depression. It's a soap opera in the snow.
Right, we're clearly not going to agree on this. We're going around in circles.
Yeah.
But you, listening to this right now, you need to look at this history yourself. You need to grab a copy of Cinema, the Magic Vehicle, read the chapter on 1913 to 1950, and watch the film, because the layers of psychology and history here are just staggering.
Think about this, though, before you make up your mind. Does a film become a masterpiece just because it survived a disastrous, mismanaged production and happened to capture some nice, snowy scenery by accident? Or are we, nearly a century later, just making elaborate intellectual excuses for arrogant artists who couldn't even keep their own house in order?